And so we're going to get started shortly. Good morning. I'm Ellis Green, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Law and Justice. And I want to welcome you here this morning. This is a great occasion for me. I've been wanting this to happen for a long time. We have some wonderful speakers and guests. But I want to say, first of all, that this conference is not a one-day affair. It's something that we have been working on for the last 5-6 months, seems like the last year. And a number of people have been involved, and they stay involved even after today. We have a meeting scheduled for May 4th at the Urban League to talk about what goes on here and how we can implement some of the proposals that come out of this conference. And we will also be working with the community on trying to develop other programs and ideas throughout the whole year. So it's just not a one-day affair. This conference, as I said, is not a one-day affair. It's also part of a three-part program that the center has presented throughout this past year. The first program, I think a number of you were there. We did a program entitled Racism, Law Enforcement, and Violence. And we had Don Jackson and Tyra Farrell at the College of St. Rose. Our entire three-part program was entitled, By Any Means Necessary, the Fight Against Racism, Police Abuse, and Imprisonment. So that started off that particular program. Part two took place in Greenhaven Correctional Facility. Some of you viewed the tape that we had here this morning. That was the result of a program that was put together by the New York State Black and Puerto Rican Caucus, by the prisoners of Greenhaven, the Center for Law and Justice, and also representatives from communities, both here in Albany and in New York City. I certainly suggest that you view this film if you haven't seen it already. I don't think we finished it this morning. It will be going on again at lunchtime. So please take a look at it. This is the third part of that series. And it was made possible by a lot of people. I want to, first of all, ask the planning committee to sort of stand so you can see who they're. I think some of them are here, or they're still out there working. A lot of them are still out there working. Well, really appreciate their contribution. Also, we want to thank WXXA for taping this. We really appreciate it. We hope to use this as an educational program in the community. It will hopefully be edited and be able to be used in schools in the community. We will also develop some written material, printed material that can be used with groups. So please contact our office for further information about that. We also want to thank the co-sponsor of this conference. It's sad to say, but sometimes it takes courage to support a conference like this. And we really applaud you. We have about 50 co-sponsors. And we believe that this conference is becoming an integral part of our community. So thank you, and we hope you continue to support us. I would also like to point out that we have a couple of special guests here today. We're very happy to see them. We have Mr. James Tuffy, who is president of the Albany Police Union, Police Officers Union. We also have Mr. John Griebert, who is the Chief of Police in Colony. They're back there. Thank you for joining us. A few housekeeping things. Let me get those out of the way. The people with the orange badges are our conference volunteers and facilitators. And I'd also like to call your attention to this blue program, which has everything in it, hopefully. This morning, we will hear from our speakers, and then at 11:45 to 12:15, we will have a community speak out. We want all of you to be a part of this discussion that will take place. So feel very free to come forth with your ideas, your suggestions, your comments, criticism, whatever. At 12:15, Lanny Walter who's here somewhere. Um, we'll summarize that session. We thank Lanny. He did a wonderful job last year, and we're very pleased that he agreed to come back this year. At 12:30, we'll break for lunch, and we encourage you to support a minority businesswoman, Mrs. Eddie Burton. She has a stand right outside on State Street, and she has a number of exciting items for you to eat. She has hot dogs, sausage sandwiches, homemade sweet potatoes, an apple pie, chocolate chip cookies, sodas, and chips, a whole bunch of stuff. And for those of you who cannot afford to buy your own lunch, we have a limited supply of lunch tickets to be used at Mrs. Burton's stand. And I underscore that they are for those who cannot afford to purchase their own lunch. Also during the lunch hour, we'll be entertained by a Troy Charisma International dance group. And there are craft vendors and information booths outside of this meeting room area. For high school and college students, there will be a drawing for prizes at 1:15 across the hall from the registration table. And at 1:30 p.m., Reverend Henry Johnson will reconvene us. He is the Vice President of the Center for Law and Justice. And we will also have an award ceremony to present the Frederick Douglass Struggle for Justice Awards. And that ceremony will be held right here in room 3. These walls will be up in the afternoon, so come right to room 3. Following the round tables, we'll convene in this room again for one of the most important parts of the conference, I think. We will have the summaries, but we will also allow proposals to be submitted for acceptance by the full conference body. The Planning Committee, as I mentioned, has scheduled a meeting at the Urban League on May 4th, and that's when we will certainly consider how we will be able to work on those particular proposals. There's an evaluation form in your packet, and please help us by completing the form and leaving it at the registration table. Also wanted to mention that we do have Mr. Wilfredo Velez, who will be on one of the round tables. Unfortunately, I think we spelled his name incorrectly. I just wanted to point that out. Are there any other housekeeping things that I should mention? If not, we'll get started with the program. Any questions? Okay. As I mentioned, I'm extremely excited about this program. And I want to introduce the person that I met 4 or 5 years ago in Green Haven Correctional Facility. It was Eddie Ellis. And that meeting for me was one of the most significant events in my life. I've learned a lot from Eddie and from all of the other prisoners at Green Haven and the other facilities that I visited. But I think above all, he communicated the urgency of all of us becoming actively involved in working to change social and criminal justice policy so that we can not only reduce crime, but the destruction of human lives, particularly those who are poor, Latino, African Americans, and other powerless groups that are continuously exploited and oppressed by the criminal justice system. I was fascinated, but also very frightened by the links that Eddie drew between racism, communities, and prisons. And we've talked about and published a lot of things about the details of Eddie's life, so I'm not going to go into all those things, because we've had Eddie's life printed in our Advocate. We have a short bio in the program and the brochure. And I'm sure Eddie's going to talk a lot about it. So I won't talk about all of his achievements while he was in prison for 23 years. And I'm sure he's going to talk about the magnificent work that he's been doing since he's been out. It's unbelievable what Eddie has been doing since he's been out in August. But suffice it to say, I consider Eddie to be my mentor and definitely good friend. And I love him and respect him very much. And so this is one of the greatest thrills in my life, to have the opportunity, and believe me, the great pleasure, to introduce you to Eddie Ellis, who might still be prisoner, but for me, he's the most powerful liberating force that I know of. Eddie.
very much. Fantastic introduction for Dr. Ellis Green and members of the Board of Directors and advisors of the Center for Law and Justice and distinguished guest. It's indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here, and after such a fantastic introduction, I wonder whether or not I'll be able to live up to that advanced billing. But I'm going to do the best that I can, and I'm hopeful that in the process we'll be able to share some insights and perspectives, and out of this dialogue hopefully will come some direction and guidance for the future and some possible ideas that we may have to begin the tremendous task of social change, particularly with reference to the criminal justice system and the prisons. Before I get started, I'd like to just say a couple of introductory background words. First of all, a lot of attention has been focused on me as an individual since I left prison in August, and that attention has centered on the fact that I brought with me from prison an analysis of the prison and criminal justice system that is very profound and very analytical, and reveals for the first time some very common and obvious kinds of things, but they were synthesized by men at Green Haven and compiled in a report that we put together. And oftentimes I am given credit for developing this analysis, and it was really a collective effort. I was just a very, very small part of a larger group, and I think it's important that we recognize them and that their proper respect, which is due to them, is accorded. And I'm speaking primarily of the Political Action Committee at Green Haven Prison that's headed by Larry White and Keith Bush and Robert Shire, among others. And it was out of this group that we began to do very serious work in terms of analysis on the criminal justice system and exactly what that system meant to us as prisoners and as people of color. Additionally, I think it's important that I point out that the actual analysis and writing and research that was done on the non-traditional approach to criminal and social justice was performed by Cardell Sherrod, who we affectionately call Blood, Hassan Gale, Lawrence Hayes, Larry White, and myself. So oftentimes you will read or hear that Eddie Ellis presented the non-traditional approach, but that approach was essentially a collective effort. Today with me I have several men who served time in prison, and I just want to start out by introducing them. On my left, Mr. George Prendez, who headed the Consensia group at Green Haven, an integral part of the non-traditional approach. Juan Harry, who was involved with the formation and organization of the Prisoners Parolees Anti-Crime Organization, PACO, and who has since merged PACO with another organization, the Community Justice Center in New York City, and who's working for social and change and political change, Westchester County. And Mr. Charles Culhane on the end, who is a major advocate and expert on the death penalty question, a writer, a teacher, and a man who all of us have spent many, many years in the prison system. Today we come together at this conference to discuss the effect of prisons on communities and to look at some of the issues and some of the alternatives. And in that discussion, I'd like to try, in the little time that I have here, to establish the parameters, the groundwork that we can build on, hopefully that we can agree on, and then we can set some course and some direction in terms of where we should be going, where we are now, and how we got to the position that we are in. We start out by examining the question of criminal justice in prisons, and because I'm an African American person, I have to examine that perspective from the perspective of race and from the perspective of class. And when we look at race and class with regards to the criminal justice system, we begin to see some rather peculiar patterns. And I think it's instructive and interesting to understand how we came to this fundamental reality. In the prisons, we began to look around in the early 70s, and what we saw was that the majority of prisoners were black and Latino and poor white people. Very few Asians at that time, very few Indians. And we began to ask some questions about why it was that a system which purported to serve the entire state seemed to be so focused and concentrated on people of color and people who did not have financial means. Seems as though every place we went, we ran into prisoners who were friends of ours, prisoners and people who came from various neighborhoods in New York City that we were who we knew very well. And out of that empirical observation, we began to try to see if we could document some sense of just what was taking place. And we investigated Census Bureau reports, we investigated Department of Labor statistics, Department of Education statistics, Department of Correctional Services statistics, and out of those statistics and out of that analysis came what we call the non-traditional approach to criminal and social justice. And I'll explain the non-traditional aspect in a little while as I get further into my presentation. We started out by asking a fundamental question, and that question is, how is it and why is it that although Latinos and blacks in New York State comprise approximately 28% of the state population, and at that time we were approximately 22% of the population, why is it that although we only comprise 28% of the population, at the same time we account for 85% of all the people in the state prison system? Why is that? How could that be? Perhaps it could be that blacks and Latinos just commit more crime than others. Perhaps we get caught more than others or prosecuted more than others. There must be some logical explanation for that phenomenon. And as we began to research this question, we came across some other startling facts. And one of them was the fact that 75% of the entire state prison population came from 7 neighborhoods in New York City. And those 7 neighborhoods were Harlem, the South Bronx, the Lower East Side, Brownsville, Bedford-Stuyvesant, East New York, and South Jamaica. Coincidentally, the communities from which the majority of African Americans and Latinos in New York City live. 7 communities in New York City contribute 75% of all the men and women in New York State prison system. Incredible in and of itself. The other 10% we found out came from upstate, the Mid-Hudson Valley, Poughkeepsie, Newburgh, Beacon area, this area here in Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo. In each one of those upstate areas, that 10% was essentially drawn from the black and Latino and working class communities. So we began to look at this phenomenon and we began to draw certain fundamental conclusions. And one of the conclusions that we drew was that there seems to be a correlation between living in certain communities and going to prison. And if you look at it a lot closer, which is what we did, we found out that there was even greater correlation between the amount of time a person gets when he goes to prison or she goes to prison and the place from which they came, the communities from which they came. And out of that analysis, we began to construct what we call this non-traditional approach to criminal and social justice. We found out, for instance, that 96% of all the people who are in the state prison system today will one day return, come out of the system. The other 4% will die in prison. We found out, for instance, that 92% of all the people in the state prison, when they come out, will return back to the community in which they lived prior to coming to prison. And that suggests to us that there is a direct relationship between communities of color and who goes to prison and for how long, and a number of other factors. Of course, that type of analysis was not well received initially, and there have been a tremendous amount of research done to disprove that correlation. And to date, I'm glad to say, or sad to say, I'm not sure which, that there has yet to be anyone who can disprove that fact. That where you live and who you are based on the color of your skin plays a major role in who goes to prison and how long. So the central overriding factor that we have to confront here today is the question of race and the question of class. And I'll say quite frankly that it's been a very difficult question to confront. America has not come to terms with the question of race and class yet. And until we do, we're going to continue to see a lot more of the same in terms of criminal justice, social justice, economic and political issues. And we're going to stay stagnated in a rut of ignorance and wastefulness. And I think that, above all, it's time for us, people of goodwill, black, white, Latino, Asian, to look at this question of race very seriously, very honestly, very forthrightly. Because until we do that, very few other questions will be able to be determined in any logical and consistent manner. Over 25 years ago, the Kerner Commission, that was headed by the governor of Ohio, Otto Kerner, produced a report on race in the United States. And that report essentially said that the United States is a country divided into two parts. There are two United States, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And we have seen the manifestation of that from that point on until this point. And this bears directly on the question of race and class in the prison system. I won't go over all of the statistics that govern the prison system because I think you know most of them. I'll say that our study started with a historical perspective. And what we attempted to do was we attempted to see how it was that so many people of color entered into the prison system. And we did a 50-year study. We started in 1940, and we broke it down into 10-year segments, from 1940 to 50, from 50 to 60, 60 to 70, and so forth, up until 1990. And we discovered a number of amazing things. One of them was that in 1940 in the state prison system in New York, there were very few people of color. In fact, the system was overwhelmingly white. In 1950, we began to see a change in that system. As fewer and fewer whites came into the system, more and more people of color began to come into the system. So by the end of 1950s, we see a system that is beginning to change in its complexion from over 95% white to about 50% white and 50% non-white. In the next decade of the 60s, we see a proliferation of blacks and Latinos coming into the system, so much so that they become the majority in the system. By 1970 to 80, we see them become an overwhelming majority, 70% or better. And then in the 80s, we begin to see another phenomenon. We begin to see the Latinos coming into the system in greater and greater numbers. So between 1980 and 1990, the system begins to fill up with Latino people. So that by 1990, Latinos represent over 1/3 of the system, and it's projected by the system, by the Department of Correctional Services, that by the year 2000, Latinos will be the majority population in the prisons. And we say that there's a direct relationship, a direct correlation between what takes place in the community and who comes to prison. And if that is true, then we can look at these communities, these 7 neighborhoods, as a microcosm, and begin to analyze these neighborhoods to see what took place between 1950 and 1990 that would seemingly account for why so many people in these neighborhoods come to prison. 1940s, we see a vibrant and solid and cohesive community. We see family values intact. We see families intact with male head of household. We see educational systems that operate effectively. We see high attendance in religious institutions. We see a workforce that is well below the national average for unemployment. And we see a community that is self-contained and that operates for the best interest of itself. 1940s and 1950s. In the late 1950s, we see a movement for social justice that begins to overturn the social status quo in America and opens up a tremendous amount of opportunities for people who had previously been locked out of the economic and social and political mainstream. But concurrently with that, we also see a migration of people from south to north, and we begin to see in the black and Latino communities a deterioration of the fundamental institutions that govern and control that community. And as those institutions begin to deteriorate, we begin to see more people of color coming into the prison system. It's instructive to look at just one of those institutions and try to understand how that deterioration and that process occurred. And that's the public education system in New York City. In 1940 and 1950 and 1960, that public education system was the finest system in the country, if not in the world. Turned out doctors, lawyers, professional people, you name it, graduated from the public school system in New York City. Now that system is perhaps one of the worst in the country, and there's serious talk about alternatives to public education, vouchers and tickets and tax incentives and numerous other kinds of fiscal gimmicks that will afford people an opportunity not to send their children to public schools because the public schools have gotten to be so horrendous. And how did that happen? How did the finest public school system in the United States deteriorate to one where people are reluctant to send their children there? And we found something interesting that happened in that public school system, that also happened in the prisons, and happened in a number of other institutions. And it is this: as more and more people of color begin to enter these institutions, the institutions no longer become capable or able to accommodate these people. And the reason for this is very simple. When we talk about a non-traditional approach to criminal and social justice, we talk about non-traditional in relationship to traditional. And the traditional approach to social and criminal justice, to education, to religion, to an entire range of human activity and issues in the United States is a system that fundamentally and essentially is grounded in a European norm. That is to say that the guiding assumptions, the guiding philosophy, the guiding ideology, the guiding religion, the guiding social practice, the guiding political system is a system that is grounded at root in a European system. It was brought to the United States by Europeans, instituted in the United States by Europeans, and for the most part served people of European origin very well. And this is as it should be, because there is a certain connection between the client base being served, who are of European extraction, and the people who provide the services, who are also of European extraction. And as long as that relationship existed, these institutions were the finest institutions that could exist. But then something unique happened. One of the things that happened, of course, was prior to the advent of the civil rights movement, by law and by custom and by tradition, people of color were locked out of these institutions. And with the advent of the civil rights movement and the gains that come about, the legal prohibition to discriminate against people, particularly in the public sector, we see more and more people of color begin to enter these institutions. And as these people of color begin to enter these institutions, the institutions no longer become capable of dealing with them because they bring with them a non-traditional, a non-European outlook and perspective on life, on culture, on history, on religion. And there is a dichotomy within the institution itself. And that dichotomy is split along two lines. Administrators on the top and service providers, in the case of education, teachers who are grounded in a European outlook on life, and a client base who are people of color who are grounded in a non-European outlook on life. And when those two cultures clash, we begin to develop serious problems. For a long time, we didn't want to talk about these problems. In most places, you will not hear this analysis because either it's not understood, or if it is understood, there is no willingness to act on it. And the reason there is no willingness to act on it is because there is a maintenance of a status quo that has vested interest in keeping things the way that they are. We see systems now that have become so unmanageable, all of their time and resources are spent in trying to manage the system as opposed to trying to provide the services the system was originally designed to provide. And we see this in the prisons, we see this in education, we see this in all institutions that have undergone this radical transformation in terms of who the system's client base becomes. In New York City, for instance, blacks and Latinos now comprise 52% of the total city population. That is to say, we are no longer a minority, we are the majority. Yet and still, if you look at all of the institutions, you will see that that transformation has not taken place on the highest levels. So what we have are institutions that are predominantly run and operated, and policies that are created by people who are grounded in a perspective of life, in a total cultural outlook that is fundamentally at odds with the people with whom they have to interact and serve. For instance, I've got a friend of mine who is Latino, and whenever he talks Spanish, his mother slaps him in the head, says, "Habla inglés," speak English. And the reason she says speak English to this little man is because she understands that in order for him to succeed in America, in New York, being a Latino man, he must learn how to speak English well. Because if he does not, he will be ostracized in the worst case scenario, and in other case scenarios will not advance as rapidly as someone who speaks English well. So what that essentially says is that we have a system that imposes its values and imposes its norms and imposes its customs and its traditions and its style on people who are fundamentally opposed to that imposition. One of the reasons why we're all dressed the way we are is because it's been drummed into our heads, of course, that if you wear this kind of a suit and a tie and a button-down shirt, you will be more easily accepted into the mainstream of American society. If I came in here with a cap on and some Reebok sneakers and a Georgetown jacket, the police would probably stop me at the door, throw me up against the wall, and want to know, what the hell are you doing here? I'm the same guy, but the way that I dress and the way that I talk will reflect basically on who I am supposed to be in the eyesight of people who have certain expectations of me. And when those expectations are not met, then I am treated derisively, and I am shunned to the side. And this is what we see happening in these institutions. We see a clash of culture, we see a clash of worldview, we see a clash of perspective and outlook, and as a result of this clash, we see these institutions not being able to function in the best possible capacity for the institution as well as for the client base that it's supposed to serve. And this is the fundamental analysis of the non-traditional approach to criminal and social justice. When we say a traditional approach, what we're talking about is an approach that is grounded in European norms and philosophy. It's middle class. It serves white people well. There is a view that the institution should shape the people, that the institution knows best, that you bring your problems to us and we'll somehow or other take care of it. And there is another fundamental assumption that one size fits all, that there is an American norm, which is grounded again in a European outlook, and that American norm fits everybody. And if you don't fit into that American norm, somehow or other, there's something wrong with you. You're not quite right. You may be okay, but you bear watching. So we've got a situation here where this, and it's important to understand that this American norm is at play very subtly. It's at play so subtly that most people don't even recognize that it's at play at all. We have been so conditioned and so acclimated, thank you, so acclimated to the acceptance of this norm, we don't even think twice about it. Black people even do it. When we look at each other, this guy don't have a tie and the shoes not shine, he must be something wrong with him. And if he's got a pair of sneakers on, God forbid. And if he's got a pair of sneakers on and he's under 6 feet tall, he's not a basketball player, so he's up to no good. Huh? That's how we think. We've been conditioned to think like that. We do it unconsciously. And it's that unconscious thought process that accounts for our policies, our rules, our regulations, our laws, the way that we view the entire world. And that is a very traditional European middle class institutional outlook on life that says the institution should shape the person and that one size fits all. We say that that outlook and that approach to things is no longer valid because the institutional base has changed. We no longer have a base whose clients are predominantly Europeans. We have a base whose clients are predominantly people of color. And so we must now begin to take a non-traditional approach to these people of color. And that non-traditional approach has got to focus on the strengths of those people. If we're talking about Latino people, then that non-traditional approach has got to be rooted in Latino culture. It's got to be Latino-centric. It has to make provisions for language differences and cultural differences, regional and geographic differences. If that client base is not middle class and has no real aspirations for middle class, then we must redesign the approach, be tailored to working class and underclass people who the institution is designed to serve. We can no longer, for instance, say that the institution will shape the people. It should be conversely that the people and the needs of the people shape the institution and how the institution responds to those people. And ultimately, we have to say that the institution cannot look at us all as a blanket, homogeneous, one-size-fits-all group. We have to say that there are various sizes and shapes within the cohort, and because of those various sizes and shapes, we have to tailor our policies and programs to be able to touch bases with everyone who's part of that cohort. So our non-traditional approach differs fundamentally from the way things have been going on because we recognize these new realities, and we say that based on these new realities, we have to begin to construct policy and we have to begin to shape the institutions accordingly. Let me tell you a couple things that we find out in these 7 neighborhoods that produce Can you imagine 7 neighborhoods in New York City producing 75% of all the prisoners in New York State? That's incredible, isn't it? I was in Nebraska last weekend at a conference very similar to this. And the first thing I did when I went to the conference was I got in touch with the Commissioner of Corrections in Nebraska. And I asked him 2 questions. Number 1, how many prisoners in the Nebraska system are black or Latino? He said 34%. I said, how many blacks and Latinos comprise the total population? He said 3%. 3% of the population in Nebraska accounts at 10 times their proportion in the prison system. So there's a correlation here between who goes to prison and what color you are. And we'll see this a little further as I get a little bit further down the line. But 7 neighborhoods in New York City, 75% of the people in the black community. Those 7 neighborhoods can be geographically identified by assembly districts, 18 assembly districts in New York City. I won't repeat all the numbers now, but I've got some literature for anybody who may be interested in specifically what the numbers are. 18 assembly districts account for 75% of all the people in the prison system. In New York State, there are 150 assembly districts, and 18 of them contribute this disproportionate number of people into the prison system. So we looked at those 18 assembly districts and we tried to determine what was going on in those districts that was not going on in the other 132 districts to a greater or lesser extent that would seemingly explain this. How could this happen? We found out a couple of things. That in each one of these 18 assembly districts there were a proliferation of crime causative factors. We call them crime generative factors that exist in these communities to a greater extent than anywhere else. And we believe that this is what accounts for why so many people of color are in the prison system. Crime generative factors. These are factors that are in existence, that are in existence in the 7 neighborhoods to a greater extent than anywhere else. And what are they? We talked about the Kerner Commission report, so the first thing is obviously racism. Institutional racism that manifests itself particularly in the area of health care and housing. In the area of health care and housing, we see conditions that are just so appalling, we can't even begin to try to fathom where it begins and where it ends. And I'm sure most of you know all of the statistics, so I won't just go into, a recital of what they are. In addition to racism, which is the #1 crime causation factor, we see a deterioration of the family structure, a breakdown of the family, even the extended family, which has, up until this point, been able to hold Latino and African American families together. We see that beginning to break down. We see a proliferation of single-parent families headed by a female head of household in proportion and numbers, percentage-wise, that is far in excess of what we would consider reasonable. We see an educational system, as I mentioned, that has totally broken down. Children graduating from high school who are reading on a 6th grade level, the highest incidence of high school dropouts, highest incidence of teen pregnancies, an educational system that young black men turn off to as early as the 4th grade. And the reason that they turn off to the system is because in the books, in the literature, in the films, in the videos, in all of the instructional material, they very rarely see any images of themselves. They very rarely see anything of themselves that is positive, uplifting, or inspiring. They very, very rapidly come to the conclusion that they are not a part of this system, and they begin to tune out as early as the 4th grade. This is not for me. I'm not down with this. I'm not even in the picture. We see a system of unemployment in the black and Latino community in New York City that is three times greater than the national average. We see unemployment in the Black and Latino community right now that exceeds unemployment in the United States at the height of the Great Depression. And from these figures we see several responses. Proliferation of welfare, social services, usually acquired by females. We see a complete abandonment of hope, which manifests itself in homelessness. And then we see a segment of the population which is rapidly growing, which takes an outlook on life that says, I'm going to try to get mine the best way I can. And that's where the encounter with law enforcement comes. And that's one of the reasons why we see so many people gravitating to what we call an alternative economy, underground economy, that involves itself in activities that have been classified illegal activities. And even the classifications of crime and punishment are based on political judgments. That crime is politically defined, and that what is criminal today, or what was criminal yesterday, may not be criminal tomorrow. And what is not criminal today may be criminal. Not too long ago, possession and sale of marijuana was a major felony conviction, in New York City at least. Now it's, depending on the weight, a misdemeanor or a simple violation like a traffic ticket. So somewhere along the line, a political decision was made to criminalize marijuana. And I wonder what the basis for that decision was. I'm sure some of you know. As marijuana began to become more widespread out of the Black and Latino communities into other communities, and as those other communities, young people began to become arrested more and more, we see a tremendous move to decriminalize marijuana. There's even talk now of decriminalizing other controlled substances, heroin, cocaine. And those are political decisions that are directly related to race and class. So we have these crime-generative factors: racism, discriminatory practices in housing and health care, the breakdown of the family structure, exorbitant rates of unemployment, miseducation, undereducation, and in some cases no education, which result in homelessness and helplessness, proliferation of welfarism, and then gravitation to the underground economy. So when I made this presentation, I had a professor from Notre Dame stand up and say, you mean to tell me, or what are you trying to say, is that so many black people are in prison because of these social conditions? I don't believe that. I believe that people have individual choices, and they make their own decisions. And people are in prison because of the decisions that they made to commit crime, and that's the end of the ball game. Thank you very much. And that's a powerful argument. And that's the traditional argument, because that argument makes people feel very safe and very comfortable. We say it's an individual decision. You made the decision. You decided to commit the crime. Do the time, shut up, and don't trouble us. Go away quietly. Well, let's look at a couple of things really very quickly. The majority of people in New York State prison system are in prison for drugs or drug-related crimes. Overwhelming majority, over 73%, almost 3/4, drug-related crimes. And yet when we look at who uses the majority of drugs in New York State, we find out that they are not black or Latino. A very recent study by the Coalition of Criminal Justice, Alice could bear witness to this, is 71% of all the people who use drugs in New York State, 71% white people, 16% Latino, 13% black. 71% all the people use drugs in New York, white people. 56% of all the people who sell drugs in New York State they're not Latino, and they're not black, you got it. So if 71% of all the people use the drugs, and 56% of all the drugs are sold by the same people, they're seeming, and 72% of all the people in prison are there for drug-related crimes, it would seem, logic would dictate that the color of the people in prison be other than what we see it is. 46% of all the people in prison are black and are in prison for committing crimes that involve drugs. 7% of the people in prison are white and are in prison for selling or using drugs. So although white people use drugs 71% and sell them 56%, only 7% of them go to prison, which is very, very unique. Right? Very odd. Gets back to race and class. And even more interestingly enough, as I was talking to this professor from Notre Dame, I said, do you know what the criteria, since your argument is essentially that these social factors and economic factors that exist in the communities have played no relationship to who goes to prison, are you aware of how people go to prison in the first place and what the determining criteria is for how much time you will get? And he said, no, I'm not. That's all right, good. I'm going to tell you what Warren Harry discovered. Warren Harry discovered, and we all knew it, but he was the first one to bring it to light, that when you get arrested and convicted for a crime, before you go up for sentencing, they give you what is called a pre-sentence report. And that pre-sentence report determines pretty much how much time you're going to get. Because if you have a good pre-sentence report, then you'll be on the low end of the spectrum. If your pre-sentence report is not so good, you're going to be on the higher end of the spectrum. And what do they ask you in the pre-sentence report? What kind of family did he come from? What's his mother's name and his father's name? What school did he go to? Does he have a high school education? Did he do any college? Was he employed at the time of the crime? Does he have a drug history or alcohol history? And all of the things that we say are crime-generative factors, unemployment, education, family structure, drug use, and previous arrests, are the very same things that are required to be answered in a pre-sentence report so that the judge will have an adequate measure to determine how much time you get. So of course, if you come from a two-family home, you have a high school education, and you were gainfully employed at the time, and you don't have any history of alcohol or drug abuse, and you're a first offender, of course, you're going to get a sentence not quite as large as someone who pre-sentence profile is a lot greater. So all along the line we see race and class fundamentally determine who goes to prison and why and how. That's going to help us because in the formulation of policy and procedure, we can now begin to focus in on the central question and begin to deal with those questions. And we start from the perspective of saying that since 85% of all the people in the prison system are people of color, and 75% come from these 7 neighborhoods, then we have to begin to construct prison policies, criminal justice policies that reflect these new realities. We have to begin to construct prison policies that are specific to the communities from which overwhelming majority of these people come from. These policies should be, we use the term community specific. And community specific means that the policies and procedures of the prison system, and indeed the entire criminal justice system, should impact on those 7 communities in some favorable and positive way. And if the prison policies or the criminal justice policies does not do that, then there is something wrong fundamentally with those policies. Let's see how that works in operation. You remember I said that earlier, the system had become so unwieldy that all of the time and effort and resources are now spent towards managing the system as opposed to providing services for people who are in the system. How does that work in the prisons? Give you one simple for instance. Overwhelming majority of men and women in the prison system are reading and writing below 6th grade level. Education is the #1 priority in the prison system, or should be. But because the system is so unwieldy, and because there is a need for management of the system, and because there are limited resources in the system, new policies and procedures have been affected that will help the system at least contain itself and perhaps grow and expand. One of those policies which came down in last year was that in order for a prisoner to acquire a general education diploma, he or she must first pay a $25 fee to take the test. Now, bearing in mind that the average prisoner earns about 90 cents a day, the $25 fee is ridiculous at the least, and certainly very counterproductive in the best case scenario. But that fee was imposed not with a consideration of the client, certainly not with a consideration of the community from which that client came and the community to which that client will return. That had nothing to do with the policy decision. The decision to impose the $25 fee had more to do with the maintenance of the system than with the services it was supposed to deliver. And across the board, over the last 20 years, we see that kind of policy thinking in corrections, in prisons, and in corrections is a misnomer. I hate to use that word. It's really interesting, you know, after the Attica situation, the state prison system turned into a State Department of Correctional Services. And I was in the system 23 years, and it wasn't that correct. And I'm still looking for the services. So we've got some misnomers working here. I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but the truth is the truth. And you know, if we're afraid to tell it, then we shouldn't even be here. So we got a system that's operating within its own best interests. And those interests run counter to the interests not only of the clients it serves, but more important, run counter to the interests of the communities from which the majority of the clients come, and ultimately run counter to the interests of the general society. There should be one fundamental overriding principle that governs criminal justice and governs the prison system, and that is that somehow or rather that system should make people safer in the streets. And if the system cannot and does not do that, then there's something wrong with the system that we need to address, and something wrong with the system that we need to change. The problem is, and we got a state legislative person here, and he'll tell you, a legislative man out of Senator Joseph Gallagher's office, who has crafted most of the progressive legislation that has dealt with prisons, Nathan Riley. I just want to acknowledge him. If it doesn't be for Nathan Riley, we'd never see a good time bill in New York. And Senator Gallagher, who Nathan works in his office, has been the major sponsor of good time legislation, among other things, in New York for years and years and years. But the problem is that when we deal with these fundamental realities of race and class and the question of community specificity, most legislative people will say that for them to get involved appears that they are somehow or other soft on crime, that they're coddling criminals, that they haven't taken a tough approach to law and order, and this is what they think their constituents want, and in most cases the constituents do want that. I want that. I don't want anybody to coddle any criminals. I don't want anybody who's going to be soft on crime, because I could possibly be a crime victim myself, particularly where I live. I live in Harlem. I could be a serious crime victim. So I want people who are going to be tough on crime, and I want law and order to be uppermost in our minds, and I don't want to coddle any criminals. I want a prison system that turns out people who don't come back. Because if they're going back, I might be the reason, and I certainly don't want to see that happen. I've got a mother, I've got a daughter, I've got a wife that lives in that community, and I don't want to see that happen. So I want to be just as tough on crime as any state legislator, perhaps tougher, because I was in prison and I know what goes on in there, and it's a joke. I think that prisons should turn out people who do not come back, and if they don't, then they are not prepared to meet their mandate, and as a group, as citizens, we need to address that and we need to change that. The key factor is that prisons must make people safer, and if they don't make people safer, then they're not doing their job. So out of our non-traditional analysis for criminal and social justice, we come up with a few recommendations I want to leave with you before I close out. The first is we say we must begin to address the social and economic and political realities in these communities first. And in the process of addressing those social problems, we will begin to address the criminal justice and the prison problems. We say there are no prison problems that do not have their origins in the communities from which the majority of prisoners come. And the most fundamental and most precious asset in those communities are our children. And so we say children first, prisons last. That is to say, if there's going to be an expenditure of resources, an allocation of budgetary monies, that those monies should be aimed at children first, improving the lot in the lives of children across the board. One of the things that we're doing in New York, for instance, and has been done very successfully in San Francisco, is to create a referendum on the ballot that a specific portion of the total city budget be set aside, untouchable, for children's issues, and that year after year, for a 10-year period, that budgetary initiative be in place. So regardless of good times or bad times, recession, depression, oppression, whatever, that money will be set aside for the children so that education, vocational training, recreation, and all the kinds of things that are necessary to address health care issues, are necessary to address children's issues, will be present, irregardless of the political climate or the political personalities that are involved. We think that children are our most precious resource and that we need to begin to focus attention on them. We say one of the major ways in which we can do that is to immediately declare a moratorium on prison construction, that we should not build another prison in New York State until the ones that are already built start working right. And until we do that, we don't need any more. We say that the money that could be saved from the moratorium on prison construction should be diverted into pretrial and social issues that focus on the children. We say that in the prison system, with the parole department, there needs to be a definable criteria as to who come home and how they come home, and that the policy of arbitrary releasing people, regardless of what they did while they were in prison, is not only foolish, it's detrimental to my safety and your safety. That there needs to be a definite criteria when a man or woman goes to prison. They should have to have certain specific things that they must do that will let us know, as much as is humanly possible, that they are prepared to return to society and remain at large in a law-abiding manner. And that includes education, vocational training, therapeutic and psychiatric counseling, and all of the other things that are necessary in order to prepare a person to come out of the prison and stay out of the prison. We say that until those kinds of things are done, we're going to continue to have more of the same. We advocate the immediate passage of legislation that will allow a prisoner the opportunity to earn his way or her way out of the prison system. That opportunity should be granted to all prisoners, including lifers, and that it should be an incentive for them to take advantage of positive and constructive programs in the prison system. And that if they don't take advantage of those programs, then they don't need to come out. And when they do take advantage of those programs and complete them satisfactorily, then we need to release them and not hold them for further consideration. We say that, in addition, we need to reconstruct a prison policy that allows us to evaluate people in prison from the time they walk in the door until the time that they get ready to leave. And that evaluation will allow for a gradual reduction in the security clearance or the security apparatus as it relates to the prisoners, so that they will be able to move from maximum security to medium security to minimum security, ultimately to work release programs and parole in some graduated phase, that there be checks and balances built into the system so that there are no abuses, either administratively or otherwise, and that the system be instituted in such a way as to allow people to move through the system in some logical and progressive manner, as opposed to the stagnation that we see in the prisons today. And finally, we say, and perhaps most important, that there needs to be community empowerment with regard to the prison system. The topic that we're talking about today, the effect of prisons on communities, can only be remedied when the communities themselves, black communities, white communities, Latino communities, Asian communities, communities of color, and all people of goodwill begin to empower themselves to have a major voice what takes place in the prisons, so that we can ensure that prisons function to the degree that they produce people who make the community safer and not the opposite. And if we do not do that, we have not followed our mandate. We say that community empowerment is the bottom line, and that the community must begin, all of us must begin, to look at these places in ways that we have not looked at them before, that we have to begin to use an analysis that more specifically fits the new realities, the new demographics that we see in these places. Finally, we say that this is realizable through the political process, and that in order for us to realize these goals, we have to consolidate our own strengths right here in this room. We have to begin to lay aside our differences. We have to begin to understand that we, as I heard someone mention before, we may not all have come over here on the same ship, but we in this boat together. And we have to understand that. Lastly, we have to begin a political process that identifies and rewards our friends and identifies and punishes our enemies. And until we develop the capacity to do that, we're going to be blowing in the wind. We must begin to organize here in Albany, in New York City, in all of the major cities in the state, for people who are concerned about these kinds of issues, economic issues and criminal justice issues. We must begin to organize in a political fashion so that people in Albany, the state legislative people in Albany, will understand clearly that it is time for fundamental change in the criminal justice system. Thank you very much for listening. God bless you. I think we're going to take questions or something.
We're first going to ask if any of the panelists want to respond or add to what you said. Okay. Warren?
No, not really. Can I speak to this?
Yes. Once they respond to Mr. Ellis's comments, then we will open the floor for questions.
Yes, I want to thank all of you for coming out today and for participating in this event also. Eddie was very, very thorough, so there's not much that I can add to the presentation that you heard this morning. I just want to ask for another round of applause for a great presentation, a lot of information for Eddie, because it was a wonderful presentation. So if you join me in that. Thank you. And I'd just like to briefly just say to you quickly that we are doing the work in an organization that we have created. Eddie said this initially, but I want to just really emphasize the point. The organization is called the Community Justice Center. We're located at 54 McCombs Place in Harlem, New York. There's some information, as Eddie said, that you can get that will tell you the address and the phone number, how to reach us. We also are building and are working with components of our organization that are up here in Albany. And Chuck, I'm sure, will tell you more about that sometime during his talk and his address to your questions. But those are the things I really wanted to just emphasize again, that we are an organization Eddie is the leader of our organization. We're all on the staff at our organization, and we are working to do this work. So I wanted you to be very clear about that we are actually doing this, and we're going to continue to do this until we actually can start to facilitate the process of closing some prisons, because those are the things we need. Prisons are supposed to work themselves out of business, and they're not doing that. So we're working to see if we can't help them in their own mission to work themselves out of jobs, because that's what we want them to do in the process of making our streets safer. So those are the things I wanted to emphasize.
Good morning. The only thing I can add to what my colleagues have said to you is to give you our phone number, which I think everything else has been said. And our phone number is 212-234-2888. Thank you. 212-234-2888.
I just want to mention that this afternoon we will have roundtables in these 3 rooms. The walls will be closed. In this room, room 3, we will have the Albany roundtable. In room 2, Schenectady, and room 4 will be Rensselaer County. What we're going to do now is entertain some questions, and I wanted to introduce Brian right here. He's going to moderate this whole session. You can ask questions of any of the panelists. All of them have had prison experience, if you want to know more about the prison itself. And then we're asking people to speak out on any issues they want to regarding the criminal justice system once we finish with those questions. Ryan?
Good morning. One thing we want to ask is that we're trying to record both audio and video. So if you could, there is a mic on this side of the room and a microphone on this side of the room, so we capture the audio without any breakup, and so we can get some clean tapes, both audio and video. We'd like people to come to the mics, okay? So, we got our first gentleman.
Okay.
Please introduce yourself.
My name is Pedro Perez, and I work with Assemblyman Javier Nieves from District 51. I don't know if our district is in Junction, but it's surrounded by Brownsville and the other one, so most definitely will be a small percentage, but will be there. My concern is in terms of legal representation for the people who are in prison. I work in prison, and I've been treating, like shit. I was a teacher in McGregor. I was discriminated. I've been trying to get some regrets for it. People are keeping silence. And I'm talking about white people. I'm talking to black and Hispanic. But my issue is this. We can not but help to relate this to what happened in Los Angeles, the Rodney King case. Maxine Waters, a congresswoman black congresswoman from South Central LA, was interviewed in National Public Radio. And one of the things that she said was interesting how a lot of help that she has been asking for years, when they found out that the new verdict, the new trial was going to come in, started pouring. She got caseworkers, she has youth workers, she has lawyers, she has judges listening to her and sitting down and cutting down on the terms that were given to the black kids in LA. You know, that's a high incidence in jail there. My question is, I know that California is a little bit ahead of us in terms of not the white norm that you have to have a lawyer to go to court. We all know where it comes from. You don't have a lawyer, you don't get defended. But my question is there anything that is being planned by any group to improve the access to the knowledge of the law. Because I know that in all of those prisons, there's a whole bunch of legal, as a legal library. And that's a lot of our brothers that know about how to defend themselves. And California, I think, is creating legislation to have these people become paralegals. So my question is, do you know of anything like that, or any group that is doing that kind of work? Because it's very meritorious. I mean, we know about the analysis that you have. We have been listening to that since Malcolm was killed. And wait, what? I don't have to tell them, 51 years old, I've been living in New York City for 25 years old. I was raised, I'm educated in Puerto Rico, but half of my life is being influenced by black culture. That's why I speak like this. And there's people who feel ashamed to be influenced by white culture, by black culture. And I've been influenced by black culture from New York City. And I say like Nelson Mandela says in the movie, the blacks from New York City be a great help to liberate South Africa.
Okay,
and
can
what
we?
say is we would like to know if there's some movement to get access to law. Once you get access to law, the whole
Well,
system.
can we give Mr. Ellis a chance to, I mean, you've made a very poignant statement, and we'd like to give him an opportunity to answer your question.
It's a good question. There are a couple of things going on. Again, this gets back to the whole question of the, you know, I spoke earlier about the system maintaining and perpetuating itself to the detriment of the client base. 15, 20 years ago, when law libraries were first instituted into the prison system, along with the law libraries was a training course to teach men and women in prison how to use the books, how to prepare legal briefs, and an understanding of law and the legal system. And men and women who graduated from that program became certified by the department as paralegals. And that program went on for about 8 or 9 years. Eventually, of course, as the budget crunch came down, the program became expendable because it didn't directly contribute to the maintenance and the management of the system. So again, this is another good example of exactly what I was talking about, and touches on what you're saying. There certainly should be adequate legal services provided for people in prison, particularly after all of the appeal process has been eliminated. Once you have completed the appeal process, you no longer have a right to a lawyer by law. By law, you have, of course, a right to attorney at trial and on appeal. The state has to provide an attorney for you. But once having undergone that process, you're pretty much left on your own. And the real tragedy, of course, is the fact that that most men are not able to litigate their cases in any favorable way on appeal, so that they're pretty much left to their own devices. So yeah, I would agree with you that that is very much needed, among other things, of course, but that is very much needed and could easily be provided if the policies and procedures of the system were geared to be specific to the clients and to the communities from which the clients come, which it is not now. Maybe Warren might want. Warren worked in a law library for years, so maybe and so did Chuck. So maybe you want to add a little something to that.
Yeah, I'd like to just add this. You know, every program that was ever created within prisons was created by prisoners. Every one of them, down the line. The law library, the pre-release, you name it, the education process, college, all of that was brought in because prisoners got out and initiated the first steps in creating those programs, and then the state eventually co-opted them because of the push from the prisoner population and did it. There are a few colleges that teach courses inside that are paralegal courses and law courses and stuff. On the street, Eddie works for an organization, which I'm surprised he didn't mention, called the Neighborhood Defender Service, which provides free counsel and investigative teams for indigent offenders in the Harlem area. That program, that idea, and that concept certainly needs to be expanded. But moreover, I think that the empowerment of the community would be the basic spear thrust, the spear tip to try and initiate programs like that, push them, and to develop them throughout, because they're needed in every community I know of, and certainly in the 7 that we've identified and the others across the northern part of the state. So in response to your question, you know, is there anything that's out there to address that? Those are the kinds of things that are here, and they need to be expanded, I think. Maybe Chuck could.
Well, I would just add that, as Warren mentioned, the law libraries came through court action brought by prisoners. Many years ago, prisoners who initiated legal suits, either on their own behalf or on behalf of other prisoners or against the prison system, they were often punished. Law books were contraband if they were in someone else's hand. So initiatives taken years ago eventually became law, and people were able to help themselves. Self-empowerment and initiative are things that are fundamental to I think Eddie Ellis's group and the Community Justice Center, and should be fundamental to everyone. It's common knowledge that the disproportionate amount of money that is given to the prosecution, as opposed to the paltry sums that are given to public defense attorneys to represent poor clients, needs to be addressed in the community. Equal justice for all will only be a reality when it's demanded, and that's up to all of us who are involved in the system.
And please identify yourself.
My name is Freeman Robinson. I'm a school teacher in the Department of Correction. And I admire you for speaking out and expressing yourself, and you are correct. But I want to bring a point to you I hope that you can express more often, is that education in correction do not teach the inmate how to survive, and it do not develop the inmate. Now, one is based on teaching the inmate to suffer peacefully, not to educate them. A lot of teachers do not know nothing about the School of Hard Knocks, and lots of the inmates graduate from that school. Some teachers show movies. As long as you do not teach the inmate due process and survival skill, you will get along pretty good in correction. I'll catch hell in correction because I demand the right to teach the student due process. All of the COs, correction officers, got up, started lying on me, trying to get me fired. 3 of them woke me up, 2 sergeants and 1 CO. I was lucky I'm still working. Now, survival skill, every Friday, all the teachers show movies, violence, sex. Instead of showing movies, I would teach the students how to survive. I told them they lacked the resources to survive. I said 2 to 1, 90% of you in jail because you did not have those resources. And when you go back home, you're going to need these resources. I was told directly, I'm a math teacher, and I'm going to teach math. But it's okay to show movies, but do not teach survival skill. I'm 64, next year I'm going to retire. But I want you to emphasize survival skill. Number 1, the resources. We need intellectual resources, economic resources, political resources, and psychological resources. And if we do not have it, nobody can survive, whether you're an inmate or not an inmate.
All right.
And I'll let you express that.
All right.
I don't know how, when I made my talk, I left that area out, and I thank you for pointing that out to me. One of the integral parts of the non-traditional analysis is the fact that what takes place in the prison, particularly in education, is not nearly related, not in any way related to the kinds of realities that men in prison and women in prison will face once they leave the prison and go to the street. And I should mention, by the way, that one of the things that we're trying to do with the non-traditional approach is we're beginning to try to change the perception of prisoners. You notice that I very rarely use the term inmate when I'm conscious. And And I try to stay away from the term corrections and all of those kind of euphemisms that have been brought down to the system. I think that those language has a tendency to cloud the issue if we're not clear on what we're talking about. And when we talk about a system in euphemistic terms, then we tend to see that system and analyze that system also in very euphemistic kinds of ways. We're talking about a prison system that has convicts and prisoners in the system. And that system is run by wardens and guards. And you can call a rose anything else. If you smell it, it's going to be a rose. There's after the Attica massacre, rebellion and massacre, this new nomenclature came down that state prisons would now be called correctional facilities, and guards would be called correctional officers, and the warden would now be a superintendent, and a whole lot of other, kinds of nicey public relations things that would allow us to think that something was going on in there that was correct and that was in some way productive and uplifting. And so just in terms of our language, we need to be clear. When we talk about a prison, let's call it a prison. It's not a correctional facility, and let's talk about prisoners and convicts. But the other point that you make is very, very key and very essential, and that is that programs in prison, and particularly educational programs, and this gets back to the demographics of who's in prison, those educational programs must not only reflect who's in prison, but must be specifically tailored to the reality of those people. That is to say, if you're in prison and you come from Scarsdale, then you need a whole set of survival skills that are totally different than I do coming from Harlem. That I need to learn certain things wherever I am, whether it's in prison or in the public educational system, that will equip me to deal with the reality of my situation where I am in my community. This is what we mean when we say that the prison policies and procedures and rules and regulations need to be community specific. And they need to impact on the prisoners and on the communities in very positive kinds of ways. So that, for instance, it's not enough for a person to go to prison and come out with a bachelor's degree. Because that bachelor's degree presupposes that you will be able to take that degree and you will be able to walk into any corporation on an entry level and be treated in an equal manner as other people who have bachelor's degrees. And you and I know that's not true. So we need to tell people in prison that even though you get this bachelor's degree, when you get ready to go for a job, there's some other realities that you're going to be confronted with, and you need to be prepared to confront those realities, because if you're not, there are going to be major stumbling blocks, and there's no telling what the consequences of those blocks might be. So I agree with you 100%. Warren can speak perhaps more on this, and maybe Chuck also, because both of them worked in schools in various prisons, particularly in Green Haven. So we know the kinds of things that go on relative to the teachers and the lack of teaching. And again, this gets back to the whole change in ethnic demographics. Almost all of the teachers are rural, upstate, conservative, white Republicans. And almost all of the students are the exact opposite. They're downstate, they're black, and they got the big job. So right away, there's a clash, or there's a conflict built into the nature of who's doing the teaching and who's doing the learning. And it's not an insurmountable problem, but it becomes insurmountable when we ignore it, or when we refuse to recognize that it is a problem and do something to address it. But one of the things that we're talking about is developing a curriculum, and I've got some material here I'm going to give you. A young brother in where's one? In Fishkill Correctional Facility named Juan Rivera, who's a graduate of our programs in the prison, developed what he calls a non-traditional approach to prison curriculum. And it's a good paper that he did. I've got a couple copies here. I'll in fact, Ellis published that. And if I'm not mistaken, either the last issue of the Center for Law and Justice publication, or perhaps the issue prior to that. But it's a good treatment of the development of a curriculum that speaks specifically to the question of how do you deal with prisoners who come from inner cities.
And I think, just to piggyback on what Eddie said, I think that one of the things we got to be really clear about is the fact that prisons and prison guards in particular work against education programs. They actively work to destroy education programs in prisons, because one of the things that they realize, the lowest recidivism percentile of every person leaving prisons, the lowest group is ex-con college graduates. So they work actually to destroy those programs. We saw it in Green Haven, in the fact of college attending prisoners being detained, more so with misbehavior reports and tickets. They usually got long sentences in their cells, which prevented them from going to college classes and facilitating their education. When I was in Arthur Kill, I had a job that was like a troubleshooter throughout the prison, and the director of vocational programs bragged to me one day that they had operated their entire vocational budget without spending any money for the entire year. I mean, you know, and in the classes, men were in industrial maintenance and radio and TV shop without any supplies, and they were going to school every day, as that gentleman pointed out, and watching movies. These guys could tell you everything that happened in every soap opera that happened for that entire year, because they were doing nothing else but watching television all day because they had no supplies. And this once again reflects the reality of what they want to return to our communities. Men who are not able to cope. I mean, if you got guys who are going in, 75% of everybody going into prison today does not have a high school diploma. You know, so if you got education programs in prisons that don't work, it stands very, very good, the chances are very, very good that the people who return back will be confronted by the same realities that tracked them into the system initially, and they will return to the same kinds of behaviors, and they'll be in our communities, they'll be in poor communities and communities of color, and we'll have that kind of criminal activity once again, which will be facilitated by the behavior of the system itself. So we must understand that this system, once again, this is another illustration of how it does not work for us, because we want to be made safe by prisons, and prisons are not working for that end at all. They're businesses, and they're designed primarily to make money and to keep people in upstate rural communities, white people in particularly, employed. That's what they're for.
Let me just say one other thing into that, and this is where the irony, I think, comes in, and that is that if you talk to the commissioner or you talk to the people on the top level of the Department of Correctional Services, they will say that we provide a wide range of educational services for men in prison. And it's true, they do provide a wide range of services. And if you look at their budget, you'll see teachers and various other kinds of counselors and things of that nature that the system does provide for those men, albeit the proportion of the budget that they spend for education and training is minuscule compared to what they spend for security. But the fact is that I think in the mind of the commissioner and his deputies, they will say that they have made an honest and sincere attempt to educate people. In fact, I heard the commissioner on television not too long ago saying that a greater percentage of young black men and Latino men were educated in prison than were in the street, or some statistic to that effect. And in his mind, of course, he believes, A, that he's doing the right thing, and that he needs to continue doing what he's doing, and that what he's doing is effective. And perhaps this is the most insidious part of what we're talking about, and that is the failure to recognize. See, I forget who said it, but somebody once said that that the real problem is not so much when bad men do bad things, but that when good men do bad things and don't even know that they're doing them. And this is the kind of a thinking that's reflected not just in corrections but in numerous other institutions with regard to that traditional mode. Traditionally, we come from this middle class, Eurocentric perspective, and this is a prescription that one size fits all, and if we hand this over to people, they'll be able to take it and they'll be able to use it in some realistic context. And that presupposes that everything else is equal and everything else is unequal. So that in addition to whatever it is that you receive educationally in the prison system or in any system, there is an additional layer that has to be included in that specifically addresses the question of race, the question of class, the question of inner city neighborhoods, if that's what we're talking about. Or if we were talking about rural upstate neighborhoods, then that reality has to be reflected in the curriculum and the approach, and the people who teach and the people who administer have to be clear about that. And the big problem in the prison system is that the people who are on the top do not seem to be clear about that, and those that are clear about that refuse to act on what they know to be true.